In this introduction to controls within AppForms video, we're going to take a look at the standard controls. By standard controls, if you look at the left-hand side of the app designer on the toolbar pane, the controls are broken down into several sections. There's a standard controls section, a validation controls, group controls, data controls, navigation, and hidden data controls. So what we're going to look at or focus on in this video are the controls that are listed here under the standard controls. Given that there are about 27 or so of these controls, which can vary depending upon whether or not certain beta settings have been enabled or disabled on the tenant, what I'd like to do, rather than go through and hit every particular property for each of the controls, because certain sections of properties, for example, the style and the attached label, have several properties that are common across most, if not all, of the controls, what I'd like to do in this video is to initially focus on some of the common properties available within these property sections, and then we'll take a look at specific unique properties that are available to a particular control. So let's initially start with some of the common properties in the general section. So what I'm going to use is the combo box control for these properties. So if you select the combo box control, and in the right hand property grid pane, there's several properties that you're going to see across many, if not all, of the controls that are in this standard controls collection. The first property is the control name, and this is a property that you can use to set a unique name for the control, which will be referenced later on within areas of the AppForms designer, such as if you're creating a rule, then you would utilize the control name property to reference the control. Another property that's common is the tooltip property. And the tooltip property is just a text value that you can specify that whenever the user hovers over the control in runtime, the tooltip text will get displayed. So if, for example, if I just type tooltip text, when I preview this form and hover over the combo box control at runtime, I'll get this tooltip text displayed. And this can be used if you want to provide some information to the user about maybe what type of data you're expecting in the control, or what that control might be used for. Another property that's common is the tab index. And so the tab index basically just controls the order of this particular control as a user is tabbing through the controls on the form at runtime. So, for example, if there were 5 controls on the form and we set the tab index for this particular control to 3, when the form is opened at runtime and if the user tabs through the controls, on the third tab, you would expect the focus to be placed into this combo box control because we've set the tab index to 3 in this case. Another property that's common is the remarks property. And this is basically it's like a comment type property that you can set for the control. It's only available in the AppForms designer, so it's not going to be shown or rendered or anything like that at runtime. But it might be useful, for example, if there are multiple designers working on a particular form. Maybe you want to provide something unique about this control that would be helpful for another designer, or maybe even for yourself if you need to go back and review the design or modify the design at a later date. And the last property I want to look at in the general section that's common across many of the controls is the check dirty property. And what this does, if you check this property, then what this allows you to do is at runtime you can utilize a rule that will allow you to determine whether or not the user has modified the data in the particular control. So for example, if I check this for the combo box control, I can then add a rule that checks the isDirty property of the combo box control. And if that property is true, then I know that the user has modified the value in this combo box control since it was initially loaded at runtime. So let me switch to the rule editor for just a moment, and I'll show you how to set up the logic for that. On this particular form, I have a check dirty, or a button that's called check dirty. And what I'm doing is I've added a decision such that we're going to retrieve the isDirty property of the combo box 1 control, and we're going to check to see if it's true. So if isDirty equals true, then I'm going to simply display a message box that says isDirty equals true, indicating that the user has modified the value. If isDirty returns false, indicating the user has not modified the value, then I'll return a message box isDirty equals false. So that's how you can utilize the checkDirty property and the isDirty property of the control at runtime to determine if a user may have modified the value of the control. Let's take a look at the common style properties across the controls. So if you expand the style section, you're going to notice there are a number of properties starting with the width. That will allow you to control the width of the control. Height, obviously adjust the height of the control. Margin, this adjusts the border around the outside edge of the control. So you'll notice as I type a value of 10 for each of the left, right, top, and bottom, you notice that we get a bit of a space added around the outside edge of the control. And that's the margin. Padding is similar, but it affects the inside area of the control. So if I change this value to 10, you'll notice that the combo box 1 text kind of gets moved around or adjusted inside of the control to accommodate the padding. Box shadow allows you to add a shadow effect to the outer edge of the control. And this can be the upper left, upper right, lower left, lower right, just depending upon what values you specify for that within the designer. You can also add a bit of a blur if you'd like to do so, and you can modify the color of the shadow. So notice now we have a shadow around the combo box control. Enable custom font. If this is checked, then it just changes your font property to the custom font. It makes it a text box control where you can type in the name of the font that you'd like to use. Otherwise, you can simply drop down and select a font that's available on the server. Font size, you can adjust that. You can adjust the font color. You can adjust the background color for the control. Visible property, if this is checked, then the control is drawn or rendered to the user at runtime. If this is not, or if this is unchecked, then the control will not be displayed to the user at runtime. The enable property, if this is checked, the user can interact with the control at runtime. If it's not checked, then the control will be displayed to the user, but will be grayed out and not, the user will not be able to interact with it. Bold simply sets the font to bold, and italic makes the font italic. Column span allows you to control the span of columns which this control can reside in. I've got some other controls laid out, so I don't really want to modify this, but if, for example, there was nothing to the right of this control in any of these 3 columns, you could change the column span to 4, and then that would allow basically to merge this column with the columns to the right, and then the control could be expanded within those merged columns. Border radius, change that to something like 10. It adds a rounded effect to the border of the combo box control to give you a nice rounded edge. If you check the enable border property, then you'll get some additional properties related to the border exposed. Border thickness, you can adjust the thickness of the border around the outside edge of the control. You can change the border style to one of the values in this drop-down list. And you can also modify the border color if you'd like to do so. Now let's take a look at attached label properties. Combo box, as well as many of the other controls here, do support an attached label. And if you'd like to display that label, you simply check the Show Label checkbox. Notice it will add a label to the control, and it's referred to as an attached label because if I drag or move this control to another cell within the grid, so for example, if I move it to this cell, notice that the label is moved along with the control, thereby it's attached to the control. The attached label allows you to specify the label text. You can specify the label position as top, left, right, or bottom relative to the combo box control. So if I change it to top, Notice it moves it above the combo box control. You can control the width, the height, the text alignment, left, right, or center, the vertical alignment, top, center, or bottom. Margin, very similar to what we looked at for the style properties. The margin just controls the space around the outer edge of the attached label and padding the inner area of the attached label. Box shadow, again, you can apply a box shadow to the attached label, which would look similar to what it does for the combo box control. You can modify the font for the label. You can change the font size. You can make it bold, italic, underline. You can change the font color. You can also adjust the background color of the attached label. The attached label also has an enable border property if this is checked. Again, it provides additional border property. So again, the border thickness can be modified, the border style can be adjusted, and you can also change the border color if needed. The next section we want to look at is the data source property. The combo box has a data source property which will allow you to customize the source of the data for the items to be displayed in the combo box. So if you want to adjust that, all you need to do is expand data source and click the little gear icon to the right of the items. This will display a data source dialog. So you have several options. You can use static, which just allows you to type in various values here, and these values would then be available within the combo box at runtime. You can also select the data to be retrieved from a SQL server, a stored procedure, a web service, or a RESTful service. For this example, I'll use a SQL server. I'll select the Northwind database. I'll just retrieve the data from the categories table. This relation page in the wizard, I'm not going to utilize it here, but if you had selected multiple tables, then this will allow you to configure a relationship between those. Category ID will be my value member, and category name I'll select as the display member. So the category ID will be the value stored, and category name will be the value displayed in the combo box. For this, you can add a criteria if you want to, but I'm not going to do that in this case. I will sort it ascending by category name. And then I'm going to select that a rule be added to form load so that the data will be loaded in the combo box when the form loads. And now my combo box's data source has been configured. If I preview the form, notice I have my values from my Northwind table available in the combo box. This combo box control also supports rules property. So if we drop down the rules and select create rule, this will automatically add a rule for the combo box and attach the trigger to it. So if I want to add, let's say, just display a text box that says hello, and this will execute now, or this will display when the user selects a value from the combo box or changes the value of the combo box. So for example, if I select confections, I'll get hello, and if I change the value at a later point, it'll also trigger the hello message box. Combo box also supports validation properties, and so there's several here. There's an is required property. If this is checked, then this control will need to be populated before the user can successfully submit the form. Notice that when you check this, you get a default text for the required message of value cannot be null. If you want to change that, you can by simply modifying the required message property. And you can specify the message position to be left, right, top, or bottom relative to the combo box control. So for this particular demo, I'll position it to the bottom. And if we preview the form, I've got a data source configured for the submit. So if I click the button, notice I haven't populated or set the value, and so I get the data required message displayed. If I then go pick a value, there's my hello message box displayed again. And when I click the button, it successfully submits. Now that we've covered some of the common properties across these controls, let's take a look at some of the unique properties for each of the controls. So let's begin by looking at the properties for the autocomplete text box. So the first property we see that's unique to the autocomplete text box is the postback property. If the postback property is checked and your autocomplete text box is getting its data from a backend data source, as a user is typing in criteria for the word that they're wanting to enter or locate, as the user types characters into the control, the data will be passed back to the server, and the server will take the characters that are provided and provide a filtered list of data that matches or meets that requirement or those characters that were specified. So that improves performance and mitigates additional data being traversed back and forth across the wire as the server is going to do the filtering and pass the filtered data back to the client. Exact match property, if this is checked, then what that does is requires the value that the user picks or types into the autocomplete text box to be one of the values that's coming back from the server, or one of the values that are part of the list of values that are acceptable for that control. Display item count, it defaults to 5, and this is the number of items that the control is going to display that meet the requirement based on the criteria the user has typed in. You can adjust this to make this a larger list or smaller as needed. The last property we want to look at in the general section is the contains property. And if this is checked, this allows the filtering to be applied anywhere within the string. So by default, when you're filtering, it's going to filter at the beginning of the string. So that's where the criteria is going to be applied. But if the contains property is checked, then the filtering will look for and locate the characters anywhere within the scope of the string and then return you back results that match. And the last property I want to mention for the autocomplete text box is under the validation section. There's a validate on save property that's applicable to the autocomplete text box, and if this is checked, this will force validation to occur whenever the record is being saved. Button control, it has a click action property that you can select from this list of items. So it can either be none, load form, clear, spell check, or close form. If you select load form, you'll get a navigate URL property exposed, which you can click this button, the gear item here, and it'll load a dialog that'll allow you to select which form you want to load when the button's clicked. If you set it to clear, then it will clear the controls on the form. Spell check launches the spell check functionality, and close form simply closes the current form. Text property allows you to set the text for the button, so I change that to hello. Notice it updates the text for the button. The calendar control, we have some properties here that are unique to it. One is calendar navigation. This will allow you to configure a form to load whenever the user clicks on a date on the calendar control, and so this will allow you to select what form you want to load, and if you want to specify any parameters to pass any data from the calendar control to the form, you can do that. Date format just specifies the date format for the calendar control. You can select from one of the date format values that's available here. Display event time will display allow you to enable or disable the display of the time associated with an event on the calendar control. Checkbox, it has a text property. You can utilize this to set the text that will display to the right of the checkbox control. It also has a default value. If this is checked, what this will do is whenever the form is loaded, the control will be loaded with the value checked. If it's unchecked, it will be loaded unchecked. Checkbox group. One thing we should note about the checkbox group is the value stored for this control, because it's a container of checkbox items. It will contain a string value with a separator that is denoted by this separator property, so that will identify which items are checked. So if there are multiple items checked, then the items checked will be listed in the string, separated by whatever the separator character you specified here. So if you want to load with the default items selected, you can specify the string here. Just make sure that you denote, if there's multiple items, that the items be separated by whatever your separator character is specified here. Text wrap will allow the data in the checkbox group to wrap if it overflows the edge of the control. Show border will display a border for the checkbox. Horizontal wrap will allow it to wrap horizontally, depending upon the orientation property of the control. And that is an additional property that's available in style. You can either set it to vertical or horizontal. Content editor control, it's got a content type drop down that you can select either HTML, script, or CSS. You have a content property that has an ellipsis. If you click on it, then it will load the content editor, so you can specify your HTML that you want to use, your CSS, or your JavaScript that you want to store or set for the content editor control. It also has an auto height property, so if you check this, it will auto size the height of the control to be able to display the content. Date time picker control. Here in the general section, you have a date format that you can select that will determine what date format it will display. You have a time picker. If this is checked, you'll get an additional time component that you can utilize to store time for the control. You have a send as JSON date that will, if checked, send the data back to the server in a JSON formatted date. And the enable mask property, if this is checked, then what this will do is cause a mask to be set on the control such that if the user is typing the data in rather than picking it from the calendar part of the control, then that forces them to enter the date in the date format specified. So the file upload control has an allow multiple files property. If this is checked, then this will allow you to insert or add multiple files to the control to be uploaded. By default, it only allows a single file. Keep the file stream. If this is checked, notice you'll get a warning about enabling the option will result in memory consumption. So what this allows is, if you check that, then once you've uploaded the file, the control will retain the data associated with it, such that it can be used if you need to upload to multiple different data sources, or it also then provides you with the option of a link to the file so that you can download it should you need to do that as well. Read only. If this is checked, then the control will display the data to the user, but the user cannot change it or interact with it. Extensions. This property allows you to control the file extensions. You can set them to either be allowed or to restrict. So if you select allow, and let's say we only want to allow TXT files, when you preview the form, and I click the button which brings up the browser, notice it pre-filters to that extension or extensions that I've specified. However, I can still drop it down and select an extension that shouldn't be allowed. Notice when I click open, it does appear to add the file to the control, but if I do submit the form, this file will not actually be submitted back to the server. And I mention this only because the behavior is a bit different when you utilize the restrict filter. So restrict means not allow certain file extensions. So I can restrict an XLSX file, and if I do so, when I go to browse, notice it does not apply any filtering to the actual file extension in the dialog. I can, however, actually still again select the workbook that should not be allowed, but again, if I try to submit this, the data will not make it to the server. So I just want to wanted you to be aware of the behaviors associated with the allow and the restrict filters. Hyperlink, it has a text property, which is the value that will be displayed for the hyperlink, and it has a navigation URL, which is going to be the URL associated with the hyperlink. Image control, it provides you with an image source or an image URL property. Image source, if you click this button, then you can navigate and select the image that you want to load into the control. This image now becomes embedded inside the form. That's the difference between image source and image URL, where you simply specify a host URL that will provide you with the image that will then be displayed in the control. Image button, it's kind of a combination of the image control and the button control. So you have the click action options, which were available with the button control. You can select none, load form, which will allow you to specify a form to load. Clears the controls on the form. Spell check loads the spell check functionality, and close form simply closes the form. Again, you have the image source that you can select the image you want to embed and display for the image button, or you can specify a host URL, which will provide you with an image to be displayed within the control. You also have a show border property, which allows you to display or hide the border edge for the control. Label control, this is just a label that you can display on the form for a given control. The difference between it and an attached label is it's not directly associated with a control, so it can be located or placed anywhere you'd like. It has a default value, which is just the text that's going to be displayed within the label. It also has an auto height property. If this is checked, then the label's height will be sized to automatically fit the content of the label control. Exact height, if this is set, the difference between it and auto height is that exact height will size the height to just enough to fit the actual content of the control. So it's a bit tighter than the auto height setting would be. Decode value property, if this is checked and the label is displaying data from a server that has had the data previously encoded, but when it was stored, then decode value will allow you to, or will automatically decode the data coming back into the control so that it's displayed in its decoded form. List box, it has a multi-select option, which allows you to select multiple items in the list box. Select all property, which will by default, when the control is loaded at runtime, select all. If you by chance check the select all, it will automatically check the multi-select, so because it needs to do that. You have a separator. Again, this is similar to the checkbox group in that the list box, when you store the value for the control, if there are multiple items selected, then the items will be stored as a string with the items separated by whatever the separator character or characters are defined to be. Additionally, the list box in the style property has a read-only property, and that is simply, again, an option to allow you to display the data to the user in a form that they can see what's been selected, but with it being read-only, it cannot be edited by the user. Mask editor is basically a text box control that will allow you to specify a template or format of the characters that are specifically to be entered. So the text allows you to provide a value to be loaded into the control when it's initially loaded at runtime. The mask format allows you to specify the data that's going to be allowed to be entered into the control. So as the tooltip indicates, the data can either be specified as numeric data by using the £, alphabetical characters using the A character, or if you want both, you can utilize a asterisk for that. So for example, if I wanted to enter something as 3 numerical digits, a hyphen, and 3 alpha characters, then the mask format would look something like that. If I wanted it to be 6 character anything, you could type in 6 asterisks. So basically you can just specify the format to be whatever you need it to be for this particular control. There is one additional property or properties for the mask that are a bit different than some of the other controls, and those are that you have a couple of additional validation properties. being regular expressions, so you can specify a custom regular expression that you want to use and apply to the control such that the data must be entered to match that expression. You can either select, or as I mentioned, enter a custom expression, or we have a set of predefined expressions that you might find helpful or useful that you can select and utilize. Multi-list box control, it has a separator property, which again, because there can be multiple items selected whenever the data is stored, it gets stored as a string value with the items that are selected separated by this separator character or characters that have been specified here. Enable top-down. If this property is checked, then you will have an additional control here and here that will display an up and a down button, which will allow you to then reorder the items once they've been selected to the selected list of the multi-list box control. The retain hierarchy property, if this is checked, then what this will do is whenever the data has been, whenever the items have been moved into the selected portion of the control, the order that they exist in here when they're then saved back to the backend data source is then retained once the data is then reloaded into the control. If this is not checked, then the order that the data is in when reloaded is not guaranteed to be the same as it was when it was initially stored. Additionally, the multi-list box also has a read-only property in the style section, and again, if this is checked, then the control will display the data to the user, but the user cannot interact with it. Password box, this is a text box control, but it contains a mask so as to hide the data as it's being entered. It contains a max length property, which is by default 255, and can be set to a higher or lower number depending upon your need. Additionally, the password box, since it is essentially a text box, it also supports the regular expression property and also has an expression message that you can customize. Next, we'll look at the people picker control. It has a text property that you can use to specify the name of the user or group that you'd like to have loaded into the control when the form loads at runtime. It has an allow multiple property where if this is checked, you can select multiple users or groups within the control. The exclude group property, if this is checked, it will exclude the SharePoint group. You also have a group property which contains a list of all of the available groups that you have, as well as an all property. You can utilize this to filter the groups by which you'll be selecting users from, or if you want to select from all groups, you can just leave it specified to all. There's a selected value display member property. This will select the field that you want to use to display within the people picker control. So for example, you may have a list of items such as I do here where you can select which item you want to be the display value. And then you have a value member property which you can use to select which field or column is going to be the value that's used to be stored back for the people picker control. Progress bar, this is one of the beta controls that if it's enabled, then you will have it listed and available for selection from the standard controls. It has a default value property that you can specify whatever the default value you want it to be at when it's loaded. At runtime, it has a max value that you can specify what that maximum value is to be. If you'd like to show the text in the progress bar, you can check the show text property. Here you can specify the text for the control. If you want to utilize multicolor, you can check this option, at which point it will expose a configure property that you can click, and then you can specify your various color properties, your progress color, font, the percentage, and the text associated with that. Under the styles, you have a line height property that you can specify. You also have a progress color property that you can specify as well. Progress tracker control has an auto height property that you can check to allow it to resize the height of the control automatically to fit the contents. You have a navigation property that you can use to specify which form you want to load when the controls click, and you can also specify if you want to pass a parameter value to that form whenever that navigation occurs. Under the style section, you have a template property that you can select the template that you'd like to utilize from the progress tracker template selector. You can specify the step size as well. Radio button has a radio group property that you can set for the group name for the radio button. You can specify the text, and this is just the text that will be displayed to the right of the radio button item. It has a default value. If this is checked, then the radio button will load selected. If not, it will load in an unselected state. And this radio button also has a vertical text style as well, so that you can set the vertical text alignment to top, center, or bottom. Radio button group. This is a collection. Controls a collection of radio button items on the control, and there's a horizontal wrap that allows you to wrap the text horizontally, and this is used in configuration with the orientation property, which is available under the styles properties, where you can orient the radio button group either vertically or horizontally. Additionally, the radio button has a read-only property that's available in the style section as well. Again, if this is checked, then the control loads, but with the data displayed, but the user cannot interact with it. The rich text box control has a default value that you can utilize to specify the text that will be loaded at runtime. So I'll just type in some text here that's formatted. There's a show source property. If you check this property, this will add a button to the control which will allow you to toggle between the display text with the formatted data and then alternate to the source text, which will show you the underlying source. So let me demonstrate that. So notice my text was loaded with the this is a test being bold and ABC123 not. If I click this show source button, which is the button that's turned on or off by that show source property setting, then I get to see the underlying source for that text. So I see the bold tag wrapped around the this is a test portion of the text. If I toggle the show source property off and then view again, notice I don't have the button to switch to source mode. The rich text box also has an open read-only property, and if this is checked, then the control will load in the form in a read-only state so that the user can see the data but cannot edit or modify it. Signature control, this is a control that you can add to display or set a signature block within your form. It contains a border property that will either show or hide the border for the control, and you can set the signature text, which is going to be the text that's going to initially load in the control. By default, it's set to signature. You can modify that if needed. There's a slider control. You have default value of which is by default 16. You can modify that. It has a max value that you can specify as well as a min value. There's a range slider property that you can check. If checked, will allow you to specify the end value and start value for the range. The increment property allows you to specify a value by which the slider control will be adjusted. There's a slider corner radius, which if set will round the 4 edges of the control to give you a rounded edge around the border. There's a mapped control that if that's set, you can specify a control like a label or text box control, and this will map the value from that text box control to your slider and vice versa. So if you change a value in the slider, it updates the value in the text box or label control. Text box control, it has a default value, which is going to be the value that's loaded in the control at runtime. Accept return, if you check this, then it will allow for multiple lines to be entered, so you can type a line, hit enter, it'll move down to the next line. Placeholder text, you can specify a placeholder text to show maybe to prompt the user what you're looking for them to enter here. You have a max length property, which defaults to 255. You can customize this as needed. Allow XML, if you want to allow XML data to be entered into the control, you can check this property. You have a text case property where you can specify what type of data is going to be in the control, if it's going to be upper or lowercase alpha characters, if you want numeric only, if you want text only. You could do text upper, text lower. You can specify to hold password data, sentence case, capitalization, integer values, currency, accounting, or numbers. And as you specify some of these values like currency and accounting, you'll get some additional properties such as a pre-value, which would be like a currency symbol. You can set the post value, which would again be similar type of character. You can set the fractional unit. If I select accounting, you also get a format for negative numbers that you can specify what you'd like that to look like. And again, some of these are disabled depending again upon what type of case you've specified. You can enable spell check. If this is checked, this will enable you to utilize spell check functionality on the control. There's an auto height, which will automatically set the height of the control. And you can also then control, if you'd like, the maximum height that you want to allow it to be set to. Encode value, if this property is checked, then if there's data in the control that special characters that might need to be encoded, then when the data is written back to the backend server, that data will be written back in an encoded fashion. And likewise, if the decode value option is or property is checked, then once the data, if it's written back to the server in an encoded fashion, whenever the data is reloaded into the control, then it will automatically be decoded. The text box supports the regular expression and expression message property that we've talked about before for some of the other controls. Timer control, there is a timer control that you can add. It has an interval property, which is in seconds, that you want to specify for the interval. There's an isActive property. If this is checked, then the timer is active, i.e. the rule will execute whenever the interval expires. If you want to disable that, you can certainly at runtime set the isActive to false. As idle timer, if this is checked, then it will run as the form becomes idle once the interval has expired. Lastly, I'd like to briefly cover how you can set or manipulate a control's property at runtime via a rule. So if we click the rule editor, I've got a button on the form where I've already pre-populated with a sample of how to set various properties of the autocomplete text box control. So if you wanted to set a property, you'd simply add an action to the rule, as I've done here. You'd begin by typing the control name, which was specified via the control name property previously. Notice you start getting IntelliSense so that you can simply click on the value and then press the period or the dot on the keyboard, and you'll also get further IntelliSense that'll give you a listing of all the properties that are currently available for that control. So once you've located the property that you want to set, so for example we want to set the value property here, you'd select the value and then a space, equal sign, and the value that you want to set it to. And that's pretty much all you'd have to do to set or manipulate a property at runtime. I hope that you found this video beneficial. Please view our other AppForms training videos for more in-depth tutorials regarding AppForms, as well as our how-to videos that show you how to implement various tasks within your AppForms solutions. Thank you.